Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world. Hey everybody, welcome back to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm Editor-in-Chief Amy Jones alongside Senior Editor Robert Lee Brewer, Managing Editor Mariah Richard, and Editor Michael Woodson. This is the final episode of Writer's Digest Presents for 2022, but don't worry, we'll be back in January. So this episode we wanted to do what lots of people do at the end of the year, and that is to reflect on the year that we've had. So hello to all of you editors. Let's talk about the past. We don't really like to play favorites here at Writer's Digest. I mean, we get to work with so many fantastic writers and authors, but inevitably some project we work on, a project or an article, becomes especially meaningful to us. So I'd like to start by sharing some of those experiences. So this year, the November-December issue is on stands currently when this episode airs, and for me, that was a huge deal. I got to interview my favorite writer, my favorite living writer, Ian McEwan, and that was sort of a moment that brought together something like 12 or 13 years worth of study and being a fan and reading literally everything that connected to Ian McEwan. I started that research. Well, I read my first Ian McEwan book, I want to say in like 2005, but then really studied him when I was getting my master's degree. And when I was doing the research for this interview, I found a whole binder's worth of papers that I had written and clippings that I had saved from New Yorker magazines from 2011 or whenever, that I had kept just in case it would come in handy. And finally it did. And to be able to sit down and talk to him for an hour about his new book was something I will never forget. That was a really special interview for me. So that was my big special project for this year. What about the rest of you?
Well, I've got to say, for me, it was probably you getting to have that interview. Actually, I think it made the whole team very happy because it wasn't a surprise to any of us what a big deal that was at the time. I also think is probably interview related, like my favorite moment of the year. And before I really get into that, I do want to touch on maybe my favorite project is one that's been ongoing for a while now. That's our Author Spotlight series on writersdigest.com. Because every week we have like 3 to 5, sometimes even more authors that we spotlight. And it's just always so fun to hear what the writing process is like, what the publishing process is like, and all the different takes that you would think after a while you'd just run into the same answers every single time. But there are always like little differences, and we run the gamut from debut authors to bestsellers and a variety of genres. It's just a lot of fun. So that project's always like up near the top for me. But then for like my one special project was earlier this year interviewing Susan Cain about her book Bittersweet, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about that later in this podcast. But it was a great treat to get to talk to her. I'd known her previously through her book Quiet, about introverts and introversion, and it was personally like a very helpful book for me, just to like
Mm.
feel like being an introvert isn't something to be overcome as much as like it is like a superpower, which, you know, I think most introverts kind of feel that way. But then like when the world's constantly trying to make you extroverted, uh, or tell you that you need to be extroverted and overcome your introversion, like it's nice to have all the studies to back up like what a great thing it is to be an introvert in this world. So that was a great joy for me personally, was to get to talk to Susan Cain about uh, a range of topics as well.
That's really fantastic. And I feel like now I need to go read the Quiet book.
Definitely.
So I guess I'll go next. I put two things on my list because I was telling Michael earlier, like if I don't limit myself, I could just like go on and on about everything that I love about my job. But this year is the first year that we started the Building Better World column in the magazine. That had been something that I was able to do online for a little while, and then it moved to its new home in the magazine, and getting to see people's reactions to that as they would get their issues, delivered to them. They would tag photos on Twitter. They would tag me in these photos, and it was just really neat to see what people liked. And then, kind of in the same vein, getting to interview Tiffany D. Jackson for our September-October cover interview. She's somebody who I've been a fan of for like many, many years. And like sometimes I just have these like moments where I'm like, that's really my job, isn't it? Like, because I think, and I know that you guys can relate to this, like we spend so much time as fans, like after we hang up our editorial hats and, we shut our laptops, we are reading and we're geeking out about, these people that we really look up to. And then when we put our editor hats back on, we have to like kind of be their peers, which is still so weird to me. But she is just like an absolutely wonderful person. And she and I both really love horror, and getting to talk to her specifically about that was a really great joy that I don't think that I will forget for a long, long time.
Oh, wow. I have two specific ones and then just one general one. I loved talking to Grace Lee about her debut, Portrait of a Thief, for our first book club selection. I think it was over the summer. Mainly just because I love talking to debut authors about their work, because they are so green and enthusiastic, and that's just like exactly the energy I need to pursue my own writing. I loved talking to her. And then we've mentioned the November-December issue, but and it's not a project of mine, but I do think we just ended the year with that issue like so strongly. I really love the November-December issue. I think that covers so many different types of writing and genres and topics, and I just loved reading that, which also just made me my more general piece, which is that this was my first like full year with the staff. I started it in the summer of 2021, but I just feel so lucky to get to like touch so many different parts of our brand, because it just makes the job endlessly exciting and never really the same thing every day. Even if it's, like Robert said, we have so many author spotlights that are going up, and I'm every single time I see that I'm putting one up, I get enthusiastic about it, because it's not the same every time. Like it's a completely different author talking about a completely different book. And so that's just kind of the more broad thing, is just engaging with our audience and other readers as well. It's just been a joy.
Yeah, I think what both of you, Michael and Mariah, said about like sort of this is our job.
Yeah.
How lucky are we to be able to do this day in and day out? Mariah, you're right. The idea of taking off your editor hat at the end of the day and going back to, just being a person who appreciates these writers and the skill that they have and then putting your editor hat back on the next day and talking to them about how they accomplished what
Right.
you were just fanning about the night before is it's a really special thing to be able to do. I don't think we could be any luckier. So something else that I thought was really special this year was returning to in-person events. We finally got back to New York City for our annual conference and to California for our novel writing conference. And for at least two of our team, it was the first time going to our conferences in person. So I wondered what your favorite part of either one of the conferences was, and what will you remember from those events? So there are two moments. I take that back. There are three moments that stand out in particular to me, but I'll let someone else go first this time.
And maybe one of our first time editors.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. My third day on the job was our virtual conference, and I was, because of that, ill prepared for what it was like to be in person. Because I was like, well, that was a breeze. And when it got to going to annual, I don't know if I ever really shared this, but I was so nervous to go for a couple of reasons. One, because I was so desperate to do a good job, and I was very nervous to represent us poorly, and almost instantly that went away. And I think one of my favorite things was just getting to work with our team in person, and in a very specific way, where we're really hustling, where we're truly watching each other's backs, where it's if we need help in a room, if there's way more people, suddenly in a group text, suddenly 4 of you are coming in with extra chairs to make sure that it can happen. And it was just gosh, this team really works hard. And I really just loved being there. And I was the whole weekend getting really emotional, just in terms of sitting and watching these brilliant authors give really thoughtful advice, watching the people get something out of it, and then me also getting something out of it. I look back on that time of being so nervous. I talk to my husband about this all the time, because I was very, very nervous. And then that night in the hotel room, he was just relieved that he was like, I'm so glad that you were having a good time, because I was nervous that you were just gonna be crying the whole time. And I was like, no, this is a blast. I don't want to come home.
I think my experience and your experience are very similar. If you don't know this, listeners, Michael and I are very similar humans, just in terms of things that make us anxious and things that we really love. And I agree that the top of my list was getting to meet everyone in person. And of course, yes, our team, but also there are contributors that I've been working with now for 2 years who I have only ever spoken to via email. Or I was able to interview Whitney Hill for when she won the self-published ebook competition a few years ago. And I've spoken to her, I interviewed her for this podcast. We've talked more, but that was the first time I saw her in person. So it was just really exciting to be able to see everybody in a different context than just hey, hope this email finds you well.
Right. It often didn't this year.
Exactly.
And then for me, something that I was horrifically anxious about, texting my spouse about, was I ran the panel discussion with our debut authors. And for some reason, just the thought of having to do that was very much stage fright. That's the kind of anxiety it was. Even though I used to stage act, and I would always get nervous, and then I'd love it as it was happening. And it was very similar. I was super, I was shaking beforehand, and then I went up there and we just had a blast. And the conversation went in really interesting and surprising directions. And I just feel really lucky for the people who wanted to participate in that panel and were able to come. And then my number 3, I put down our keynote speakers. Because like I thought I knew what it was going to feel like to sit in a room with all of those writers and listen to these people like tell us their experience with publishing and give us advice. But I truly was like not prepared for it. And on the third day, like Tiffany D. Jackson was our final keynote speaker for the conference. And I literally was like weeping in the back of the room just because like I think all of the emotion of the entire event kind of like snowballed into me. And I was like, wow, like it's been a long time since I've been able to be around that kind of creative energy. And, you know, just everyone there was so excited to be there. They wanted to learn, they wanted to help. And it was just a really wonderful experience. And like, I'm already looking forward to next year's annual because of it.
I have 2 quick things to say in response to that. Number 1, you did a fantastic job moderating that debut author panel. I sat in on that session and really enjoyed that conversation. And you were not the only one sitting in the back of the room crying during Tiffany D. Jackson's closing keynote. Hearing her journey from being a person who like sat in our literal seats as Writers Digest conference attendee to being the keynote was
full circle.
That was a great moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I was totally tearing up during her thing, both as like a fellow writer, but also as somebody that's worked on the team for so long, to know what kind of impact that we have. 'Cause we're all writers, we're all in this together. I think there's a few moments, more than a few moments that really stood out for me. But one of the biggest was just being around writers again.
Yeah.
I've been to many events over the years, but since I think I did a small event in January or February of 2020 locally. And it wasn't until we went to New York that earlier this year that I had been at a writing event, and we had done things virtually. And like as an introvert, like I'm totally fine with that. And you know, I get nervous about travel. I get nervous about being around strangers. So like there was part of me that was thinking, do I really even want to go to a live event and be around people? I'm not sure that I do. But then once I was around writers, like I didn't realize how much my soul was missing just being around writers, other people that many of them introverted like I am, many of them always reading and writing, and that's what they care about. You can know, like in the real world here where I live, if I say I'm a writer or editor, people's eyes gloss over and they're like, you know, they're not into it. So just being at an event where everyone there cares about the things that I care about, like I didn't realize how much that was missing from my soul. And like I would advise any writers that like over the past few years you have the same feelings I had before the event. If you're questioning whether you need a live event, and this isn't even saying like that you go to the Writers Digest one, if it's like a local conference or semi-local conference, I would urge you to go, because it really just on a human level meant a lot to me. And I think Tiffany Jackson's keynote at the end just like tapped into that feeling that I'd been feeling the whole time we were there in New York. And then I felt it again when we went to the novel writing conference in Pasadena. Just, you know, it was a different vibe. It's more laid back than in New York, but just being around the writers again, I was like, oh my gosh, like like, I don't want to travel and stuff, but like, if I could do this like every month, somehow, if it could just come to me, like I would love it, just to be around, other writers and editors. It does, and this is as a very big introvert saying this, like, it just feels really good to be around everyone. But as far as like other like specific moments, it was really nice to, like, as you mentioned, just being able to meet some of our contributors again. Some of these people, like, I've met before, and like, it's just good to actually talk and just be able to see, like, Jane Friedman, Bob Eckstein, just be able to, like, actually sit there and talk in person. But then maybe the biggest moment for me, and this is kind of personal, is my daughter's favorite author was at the novel writing conference, K.R. Alexander, who writes horror, mid-grade horror fiction. And it was really cool to be able to have my daughter's absolute favorite author there, get an autograph for her, send her pictures. She was so excited. K.R. Alexander was so excited that she was excited. So that was a really big moment that also just made me feel good as a parent as well.
That's awesome.
I love that was able to happen. I think that's so cool. And I will echo your sentiment about, like, anxiety or nerves before going to the conference and thinking about, like, this is a lot of people. I haven't been around that many people in years.
Since 2019. Yeah.
So do I remember how to, like, function as a human being in front of people and not my cats? Because those are very, very different things. But it was so great to be back, like you said, among writers and like-minded people who have shared interests with you, and be able to talk about that thing that you love for the entire day, which is something that, like, we sit here and Slack with each other about our jobs. Slack the app, not slacking on our jobs. But to be around all of those people who also feel the same way, it was really fun. I was going to share my two
of course,
2 or 3 favorite things about the conferences. We had booked Beverly Jenkins to be a keynote. I want to say, or we had been talking to her about being a keynote for something like 3 years. I think the first time I emailed her was 2019. And to be able to finally meet her after all that time and have her come and represent romance novelists to the entire Writer's Digest community was fantastic. She did not disappoint. I think she's just a powerhouse of a person, and I love that she loves her genre so much, and that her message to all of the writers was, write what you love and don't let anyone shame you for writing what you love. I thought that was a great way to open the conference, I thought. The other moment that was meaningful to me was being able to interview Marlon James, which is a sentence that I never expected to say, because the idea of interviewing anybody on stage in front of hundreds of people is probably one of my worst nightmares as an introvert. Like, that's what in addition to just being anxious about being around people, that many people, after years, interviewing an author whose work I've respected and looked up to for, I think I was introduced to Marlon James, I think, in 2011, when he was in Dayton for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and have been following his work since then. And to be able to talk to him about how he crafts these huge worlds in his books, and do that in front of people, was just really cool. But also, Mariah, to your point about stage fright, I'm just really glad that I survived that.
You did an exceptional job, though.
Yes, you did.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, I would not have had any idea that you were nervous.
Oh, I was so nervous that I had stopped shaking. Like I had been shaking so much and then I stopped because I was too nervous to shake. So I mentioned earlier in the introduction that this was like the first year of our podcast, and we had been talking about doing a podcast for, I want to say, as long as I've been with Writer's Digest, and probably before then. So I wondered what has been the most fun or exciting part of having this podcast to each of you. Robert, this was sort of, you'd been talking about the podcast for a long time, so maybe you want to go first.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I really enjoyed, and I'm sure like everyone else feels the same way, it's just really been fun to have a reason for us all to talk, not about just like work or, talk about the thing that we care about. Like we're all writers, and in addition to being editors, and it's great to have something that forces us to just sit down and talk about the things that we care about, which is different topics about writing and reading, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think for me, I feel very similarly. I love having an opportunity to talk to you all since we are not in the same office, and we're all in different parts of the country at this point. Being able to sit and have conversations with you and learn what interests you about writing and editing, and have that be useful, hopefully, to other people as well, has been a lot of fun. I think the other thing that I really enjoyed, and Michael alluded to this earlier, is I love our Writer's Digest book club. I think it's so cool that we get to that we can pick a book that we think is really well written and talk to the author about how they did that, sort of deconstruct it. I think that's an interesting way to focus a book club for writers. So more of that in 2023 for sure.
Yeah, I agree that I think our conversations, like our editor chats, are some of my favorite parts. I think it's because like it's different than other times that we meet to chat, because we're usually like more focused on like the mechanics of editing, and here we're allowing ourselves to be like a little bit more creative, a little bit more like the writers we are, and we get to nerd out about stuff, which is like my favorite thing to do. But I also really love that we include other industry professionals. So, like, not just authors, but agents as well. We've had on the podcast. And it's always interesting to hear, different sides of this industry, what people are interested in, what they're thinking about, what makes them excited. And I'm really looking forward to doing more of that next year.
Yeah, I really love the podcast. Does feel like an intersection of us as editors and us as readers, and I think we get to be naturally like less edited as we're talking, so it just feels more. There's just more. There's more creativity naturally in our conversations. I love these chats. I love our editorial roundtables, but I really love the book club, and mainly because I'm in a book club as outside of work, and I'm always reading something that I was not on my radar in my book club, which is my favorite thing about my book club, and that has been true too with our Writer's Digest book club. Is that we're doing genres that just aren't generally on my radar, and so it's just like making my reading branch out, which I think is only helping my writing, and it's just I think a great example of that. This truly is like a dream job situation, because I'm just getting to learn so much every day that is helping me personally, and it's what I do. It's just my profession as well. It's just bananas.
Yeah, and I do want to add personally, one of the things I love, and this really doesn't benefit our listeners, but our conversations before and after we hit
That too.
record, there have been some really interesting moments on that. And I started thinking about how that's another benefit of going to a conference is that you can have some really interesting conversations with fellow attendees, presenters, the people who are hosting it, things that you never think you would talk about, and things that may go into a story in the future.
Yeah, I feel like there have been lots of behind the scenes conversations about ghosts before and
Oh,
after
yes.
recording our podcast, which
I
yeah,
forgot about
may
that.
or may not
some
appear in the
trouble
story.
sleeping afterward.
I'll add one more thing, and only viewers of the podcast on YouTube will know. But I also, one of my favorite things is the intermittent four-legged friend that joins the podcast every so often. Any one of us, but usually it's a cat or two.
Oftentimes it's Millicent. In this episode, it would have been great if it had been Bryony, because I named her after a character in an Ian McEwan novel. Because I'm
That's
that big
bad.
of a fan. I didn't tell him that, though.
Oh, you should have. Why did you not tell him that?
He writes some books about stalking and characters being stalked, and I didn't want to.
Gotcha. You don't want to be inspiration.
I don't. Not in
Yeah.
that way. Michael, you kind of mentioned this, about being around writing all day and helping with your writing, like outside of work. And I wondered if we could get, personal about ourselves as writers for a minute and ask about your year in writing. How do you feel about the writing that you've done or not done this year?
Personally, I feel like I've just learned a lot about how to make my writing better this year, and in ways that I just was not really ever letting myself approach, because I was just so married to how I like to write and the sentences I like to write and the way I like to write. I'm never going to change it because that's not the problem with my writing. And over and over again, just learning that there's just ways to make it even stronger. And I was just telling my writers group this recently, that through work, and because we get to cross genres and I'm learning things through genres that I don't write in, it's just making my writing better, and just making me less attached in the best way to what I'm working on, so that I can just let it sort of come out of me instead of from me in some way. I feel in the I just feel more confident in moving forward with what I choose to write, more than anything, because I feel I've literally written more in other years than I have in this year, and I've done just a lot more editing on my writing this year. But obviously, I think that counts. But I don't think I could have gotten there without what I've learned this year from other writers that we work with.
Yeah, for me, I feel like we've mentioned this being a dream job, and I've been working with Writer's Digest for 22 years or about when this episode drops, and I still feel like it's a dream job. Becomes more so every year, but one of the great things about this job is that I get to write as part of my job. I get to write stuff for our website, for our magazine, nonfiction. I get to do a poem each week for our Wednesday poetry prompts. In April and November, I get to write a poem a day and call that my job. And one of the really special things this year was doing Mariah's Flash Fiction Challenge in February, and that helped me unlock and start to get to know people in this town that I'd been creating this world around since 2000. 2016. So, but I'd been creating this world and all these ideas for it, and uh, but like all the doors were locked to get into the town and get to know the people. And Mariah's Flash Fiction Challenge specifically really helped me start to unlock some of those doors, get to know some of the people, and that's been really great for this year.
Yeah, kind of going off of that, since I wrapped up the Flash Fiction Challenge in February, I have not written anything at all. But I'm actually feeling really good about that. I've been having lots of really good ideas, and I just sort of jot them down and let them sit. And otherwise, I have been reading a lot. And reading in a way that, like, the past couple of years, I feel like I've been focused on, like, my backlist books. I've been focused on reading things that are kind of like, oh, you haven't ever read that before? Like, you got to read this book. And then also reading, like, brand new releases. But this year, I have started to reread a lot of books that I haven't read in many years, but I greatly loved. And a lot of that has been like genres that I have sort of fallen out of touch with. Maybe other people who have gotten MFAs will commiserate with me, but like certain programs discourage certain genres. So I kind of stopped reading a lot of YA and a lot of romance. And I have gotten back in touch with my love of those genres, and I'm just like having a blast reading things many years later and seeing these books that I love from a very different perspective. So I think, like, in a way, that is going to make me a better writer, even though, like, it's one of those weird things where my spouse totally doesn't get it. He is not a writer. But he's like, how can you be writing when you're not writing? Like, when you're not sitting at your desk typing words out, how are you writing? And I'm like, well, there's a lot of different factors that go into being a creative person. And to me, reading and letting ideas mature before I approach them are two ways that creativity thrives in me. So, like, maybe next year I will get a lot of words on the page and I'll do NaNoWriMo and it'll be great. But this was not the year to do that.
Well, I agree with you completely, though, Mariah. I'm glad you're bringing up reading as like a strength this year, because it also has just been, this is the most fulfilling reading year I've had in years, and part of that is because of, I also changed. You are saying you like reconnected with genres that you used to love.
Mm-hmm.
I just changed my goals this year. So at the end of what year is that? 2022.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. At the end of 2021. I had decided to stop like tracking my reading in terms of like books read, like number of books read, which works for a lot of people, but I've just learned it does not work for me. I don't engage with the books as I'm reading them because I'm so stressed about, I have to finish up by this date so I can start the next one, to finish up by this date to reach my goal. And it took me forever to figure out why I just wasn't engaging with books that for every reason I should be loving. And then I just made the conscious decision to stop doing that. I like forget to update my Goodreads all the time, and just like spend as much time with the book as you want, and just really truly read it and read the books that you want. Because in doing that also, I was avoiding books because they were too long and I would get off of my goal, and so all year I've just been not really worrying about how many books I've read. I don't know how many books I've read this year, and it has been, I've learned so much from reading this year. And I just feel really connected to the books I've read this year more than I have in a really long time.
Mariah, you mentioned NaNoWriMo, and we are recording this in the middle of November, a little bit before the end of the actual year. But I'm actually doing NaNoWriMo this year.
Oh, yeah.
I think like I have said that I wanted to do it for the past 2 or 3 years. And in fact, like when I logged into my account, I had started challenges and they had like 0 words attached to them. But I feel like I don't feel like I know I've actually been writing this year for the
That's
first
awesome.
time, like creatively writing fiction for the first time in years and years. It feels like I've been sort of sitting back and absorbing all of this stuff for so long. And I kept saying like, oh, I want to write again. I want to write again. And I didn't for whatever reason. And then there's some idea that just stuck with me this year. And I didn't mention this when we were talking about the conferences, although I should. It came to me sort of between our annual conference and the novel writing conference. So I decided when I went to novel that I was going to pretend I didn't work for Writer's Digest and attend it as a writer, which meant like participating in the sessions the same way everyone else did. And it was incredible. I had such a fantastic time. There were several workshops that sort of freed my creativity a little bit, but the one on the last day with Georgina Marie, it was improv for writers, where she takes these improv techniques that are used for stage and comedy, and she's adapted them for writers. And we were doing these exercises, and we had to write. She would give us this totally weird random idea prompt, and we had literally 1 to 2 minutes to write as much as we could, whatever we could, the first thing that came to our minds. And that was such a wonderful exercise for me, because I have always been so very in my head with writing that I will compose these sentences in my head, and unless it's perfect, I don't write it down, which means I haven't been writing to me. I haven't put anything on the page, and nothing ever gets beyond an idea. But that workshop really forced me to think about what I was writing in a way that's, the first thing that comes to my mind might not be the level that I want it to be in terms of quality or idea, but putting those first words down can lead to an idea that does resonate, or a sentence that does feel good to me as a writer. And retaining that thought process as I've been participating in NaNoWriMo has been, I don't know, kind of a game changer for me. Wow. I feel like I like writing again. I'm trying not to judge myself. I know what I write in Nano isn't going to be, a thing that I put out into the world, but maybe it will lead to something that I do later on, So it's been kind of a big year for me in that way.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm glad for you.
Yeah,
thanks.
That's great.
And it's made me excited for Flash Fiction February.
Yay!
Because it also, like, having 1 or 2 minutes to write something really fast, like write a story or an idea in that time, I can do that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's what really unlocked it for me. I tried doing Nano in 2021, and just the idea starts to get kind of big when you're thinking about, when you're using like a running analogy, thinking about running a marathon sounds really intimidating, because it is. But running 5 yards down the street, like I could do that,
right.
and then stop and catch my breath. And so that's one of the things I really like about Mariah's Flash Fiction Challenge, was every day I'm actually limiting myself, write less than a certain amount of words per day. And in a way, like, that opened up a lot of doors, because it's like, I'm keeping it short, So I am also looking forward to doing that again.
I
in
am as well.
2023.
Yeah.
Good.
No pressure.
Yeah, right?
I've actually I've been thinking about it, and this is just one of those things, like, if you know me, you know that I'm always thinking 5 steps ahead in like every aspect of my existence. But I have been already thinking about Flash Fiction February. And for those of you who haven't participated before, I will put up a prompt at the beginning of the day, but I will also have an example story of my own. Um, and I was kind of like, how am I going to make it more challenging for myself this year? Because this will be the 3rd time, I think, that I'm doing it. Um, and I've just been really, really inspired by Rand Walker. And I think that I'm going to really challenge myself to write like 50 or 100 word stories. Because sometimes even though I know it's flash fiction, like Robert says, the idea just starts growing. And so all of those stories that I post for that challenge are first drafts. But a lot of them end up feeling like beginnings of longer pieces. So I'm really trying to like really dive into that flash feel. And if I can do that in 50 or 100 words, like, I think that will help me when I revisit flash pieces that I've already written, and I need to take them from like, this feels like a beginning, to like, this is a complete story all on its own. So hopefully you guys will join me this February.
I'm glad you mentioned Rand Walker and him inspiring you with the 50 and 100 word stories, because that's exactly the approach that I was thinking about for that challenge. And it's because, I sat in on his microfiction class at Annual and have read his articles about it, that there's something about that challenge of making a full story in that very specific word count that is really enticing to me.
And he's also a master at it. Like,
He
if you
really
ever
is.
need to analyze someone's work, to study it and figure out how to do it yourself, like, I really highly recommend him.
Oh yeah. Yeah, this is getting ahead of ourselves, but his collection called A Burst of Gray, it's a novella made up of 100 word stories. It's 100 word stories, and it is just one of the coolest books that I've read. The structure of it is fascinating to me, and he
What a
really
lovely
pulled
title.
it off. Yes. Okay, well, since that wasn't going to be one of my book recommendations for this episode, but Michael, you mentioned that this was a great reading year for you,
Yeah.
and it was for me too. I read a lot of really fantastic books, and I don't think we've done an episode of this podcast where we haven't recommended books for our listeners to read. So I'd like to ask what some of the best books that you've read in 2022. And in the spirit of the idea that a good book is a good book no matter when when it was published, it could be backlist titles or books that came out in 2022 that you're really excited about. And I will not go first because I have a lot.
I don't mind going first. I limited myself because I think I also had a really, really good reading year. I will just say to our listeners, if you ever want to know about books that are coming out that I'm super excited about, always check out the Breaking In column in the magazine. Every issue I feature 3 books that I just really think everyone should read. And off of one of I was talking to Michael about this earlier. I was like, I had to force myself not to do just like Breaking In authors. But I did pick one because I really think, like, when I look back on this year, I will be like, this is the year when I first read The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. I think that it is, even if you don't like horror, like, this is a horror for you. It is just extremely beautifully written, and it's spooky without being like triggering in the way that I know that some other genres of horror can be. Also, Lizzie Blake's Best Mistake by Maisie Eddings. It was her second release. She was on the podcast earlier this year talking about her debut book, but this is her second one. And it was just a joy, and also really, really excellent, non-romanticized writing of a character with ADHD, which I found very refreshing. And for Poetry and Yet by Kate Baer, I made the mistake of reading it on an airplane, and I was like sobbing.
Yeah.
It was just like so emotional, and I feel like personally, like I read it at a time when I really needed to read it. But I'd recommend it. Like, again, even if poetry isn't really your thing, I really highly recommend checking it out, because I think that sometimes when we dismiss certain genres, we lose something, either something that can be gained like emotionally, or something that we can gain for our own writing. And I just think, like, if you don't read her, you are missing out. And I have one more. My last one is like more of kind of like a personal surprise for me. It was Expecting Better by Emily Oster. So we are in our household, we are expecting our first child. And this was a nonfiction book that my spouse really connected with, because he does, like, he's a lobbyist, and he analyzes data. And like, when doctors were telling us information, they would say things in very general terms. And he was immediately like, no, I need that in percentages. Like, you need to tell me, like, is that like 78% effective, or is it like 99% effective? Because like highly effective doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
So this was a book that we read together. And it gave us like a lot of really good conversations that we could have, a really like broad understanding of like what pregnancy is like here in America and our healthcare system, which I found to be really fascinating. And again, it's like one of those weird things. Like, I have been recommending it to my female identifying friends who are not pregnant, because I'm like, this, like, we were not told these things as we were like in our high school health class. Why did we not learn these things about ourselves? So it's just like really opened my eyes in a lot of way. And it's also just like really fun to read. She has a really great voice. And if you love audiobooks, she reads the audiobook herself. So
Nice.
I do recommend that.
Very nice. And congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
Well, I have 3 that were published this year, and 1 backlist that I reread this year to recommend. But we also have, in our November-December issue, we have some or is it November-December? Have recommendations from all of us of certain books. And I believe Kate Baer is in that as well. She's a contributor in that issue, right?
Jan-Feb.
Right?
She's
Jan-Feb.
in the January.
Yeah.
Yep, the upcoming
soon.
one.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, the first one I have is called The Swimmers by Julie Atsuka, which with a gorgeous cover. And I was really surprised by this one. The first half is written in second person, I believe, and then the second half is written in third person. It's a teeny tiny little book, very sad, but really, really good, especially if you're a writer looking for like different writing styles to learn from. I highly recommend this one. And then another one is Companion Piece by Ali Smith. She is one of my favorite authors. She wrote a collection of books called The Seasonal Quartet, Autumn, Winter, Spring, and Summer, and then published this one, I think 2 years after the last of those came out, as sort of a companion. And if you are looking for intentionally timely books, beautifully written, I highly recommend them. And then my third one that came out this year is Just by Looking at Him by Ryan O'Connell. a really, really good queer, very contemporary novel. And then the backlist book I brought it because I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but there was a portion of time in COVID that was like the worst for me personally, and I'm sure there's a worse for you personally for each of you, that you couldn't pay me enough money to convince me that I read certain books. Like I have no memory of that time in my life anymore. And for exciting reasons, I reread Real Life by Brandon Taylor. And um, it felt like I was reading it for the first time. Like I was just like, this is incredible. Why don't I remember any of this? I was like, oh, I was reading it at the darkest period of my life. And so like, I recommend like, if you are a reader and that reading is a comfort for you and you were doing a lot of that during a certain time, like maybe reconnect with those books and see what you get out of them that is different from then, because it really truly feels like I read it for the first time, and it is just such a stunning debut.
Yeah, I have to say, during the darkest points of COVID for me, I was doing a lot of rereading of things because it just felt comforting
Yeah.
to help
Smart.
get me through at the time. Um, yeah, so I was just going to mention the title that I'd highlighted in that November December issue, though I thought I might add another one as well. But that title was Bittersweet, How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole by Susan Cain. And it was one that I wanted to interview her because of her earlier title, Quiet, about introversion. But, and I loved how that book was very engaging and at the same time, like, shared like the data and the science and all kinds of different reports that like kind of back up things in addition to like these very personal stories of introverts. But then in this Bittersweet book, kind of the whole premise of well, the idea for the book started off not as Susan Cain wanting to write a book, but just thinking about the idea of listening to bittersweet music and sad music, even when you're in a good mood. She shared the anecdote of when she's in college, like friends saying, why are you listening to this really depressing song? Like what's wrong? But she really dives in deep about like how these bittersweet, whether it's music, art, these moments like kind of speak to our souls and can really make, or at least some of us, feel good, like even when we're in a good mood, listen to some of this like kind of sad music or bittersweet art, things that kind of transcend. And then she not only talks about it on a human level, like how it makes us feel, but then like really gets into the art side of it, which I also found really interesting as a writer, reader, person that consumes art at museums, watches, just every part of aspect of it. So that was a really, I figured it would be a good book just because I enjoyed Quiet, but like it ended up being very fulfilling, and I think any kind of writer, artist should pick it up and check it out as well.
Yeah.
And then the other one I wasn't going to mention, but decided to, and this is reading outside of my genres, was I mentioned earlier getting to meet my daughter's favorite author. But, as a parent, like one of the things I like to do is when my kids are reading things, read it as well to understand what it, like, just even though I know I'm going to interpret it a different way than they do, just to have an understanding of like, what is it that they really like to read? Like, what are these stories? And reading Scare Me by K.R. Alexander, middle grade horror, and I could immediately see why my daughter liked it, and I liked it as well, is that the protagonist sets up these, every Halloween sets up like a scary, like a haunted floor at this local museum space, and they have like kind of a competition with that. And for our family, every year in October, though we missed it this year because two of my kids got the flu right around Halloween. They both had to miss trick or treat, but we always do this haunted garage where we decorate, and we do a ghost walk in our neighborhood where we tell stories, scary stories with the neighborhood kids. And anyways, so Scare Me by K.R. Alexander, that was also like just a fun read as well.
I love that there's that connection between what she finds appealing in the story with part of your real life, of her real life.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's great. I have a stack, so I'll try to not get too in-depth with them. My first one is How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. It is listed as a novel, but when I read it, it felt more like a collection of interconnected short stories. It is a pandemic novel, not our pandemic, but in the premise is that climate change has melted the permafrost in Siberia, I want to say, and a virus escapes from fossils that have been, well, they're not fossils, but remains that have been frozen in time for millennia. And it sets off a worldwide issue, and it follows different characters in each of the stories over the course of hundreds of years as they reckon with what has happened. And that sounds incredibly dark, but there was a lot of hope and imagination and exploration. I think it was just a really creative book. I think it would be classified as like speculative literary fiction, but the way he tied the end to the beginning was, I think, just masterful. It was a really fascinating read, and not at all like our pandemic. So no fears there. My second one is All Her Little Secrets by Wanda Morris. We had Wanda teach at a couple of our conferences, including the novel conference in California. And this was her first book. And there was a whole lot of hype around it. It won a lot of awards. It was nominated for a lot of awards. And it lives up to the hype. It's just a really great crime thriller. The characters are flawed, but you're rooting for them. It's really dark. You could see it actually being a thing that happens, and I loved it. I thought she did a great job, and I immediately bought her second book, and can't wait to read it. My third one should be no surprise to anyone. Lessons by Ian McEwan. I will admit I had kind of a hard time getting into it at first. The opening was a challenge. The premise was a challenge for me. It's about a guy who is reflecting on his childhood, and in his childhood, his teenage years, he is at this boarding school and during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he thinks there's going to be he thinks he's going to die in nuclear warfare. And so he has an affair, which is not an affair because it's very, very illegal, with his piano teacher, who is an adult, and he is 14. And that is like the premise of the book. And it follows him throughout the entire rest of his life into his 70s, and sort of how those formative years impacted the decisions that he made, and impacted decisions that were made for him over the course of the next of all those remaining decades. And as a fan of Ian McEwan's writing, I think other fans of his writing will really, really appreciate this book, because it felt like the culmination of all of his other writing came together to form this story. You will find hints and echoes of his short stories from when he first started writing in the 1980s to the themes of some of his more recent books, like global warming with his book Solar, or A Reckoning, like with Atonement. So it's and then it deals with actual contemporary issues like Brexit and COVID, because he was writing it during those times, and it is set in our world. So it's worth getting past those first few bits. And then I'll go through these next ones really quickly. Our Country Friends by Gary Steingart is another pandemic novel set in our pandemic, our COVID pandemic. But he's such a funny writer. He treats it like really humanly, but with humor. And it's about it's about a writer who lives in sort of upstate New York, and he brings together a group of friends to sort of ride out the lockdown with him. Originally, he wanted all of these little houses on his property to be sort of a writer's retreat, and that is not what they end up being used for. But it's a really great, humorous read. Don't Cry for Me by Daniel Black is an epistolary novel. It's a series of letters that a man is writing to his son from whom he is estranged. And it's you will cry. It is sort of a story of a father asking for forgiveness for the way he treated his son. Very, very backlist. The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. I love his writing, and for some reason I had never read this book. I purchased it when I worked at Borders, which was at least, well, they closed in 2011, so more than a decade ago, and it's been on my bookshelf ever since, and I'm so glad I read it, because it's just, I understand why it won the Booker Prize. It's a beautifully written book, and I love Ishiguro's like tone that he has throughout all of his works. My very, very last one, I'm sorry. I'm currently reading Less is Lost. I was very hesitant to pick this up, but I bought it the weekend it came out. I still love Less by Andrew Sean Greer. It is one of my all-time favorite books. It's just so heartwarming and lovely and funny. And I was really worried that a subsequent novel, wouldn't live up to that and my feelings for Arthur Less that I got with reading that first book. I have about 30 pages left to go in this one, but so far it is, it's holding up to my feelings for the first one. It has the same tone and the same feel to it. Arthur's still a goofball, like a very heartwarming goofball. And I'm really glad to be back in his world.
Oh, I'm really glad to hear that. I have that too, and it's on my TBR, and I've been very nervous to start it, because Less is truly one of top 5 favorite books of all time for me.
Yeah,
it's so funny because I'm in the same boat, so I'm happy one of us is finally reading it, so that they can tell the rest of us no, it's okay, you can go ahead.
I want to make a quick clarification. As I mentioned the swimmers, I felt like I was saying it wrong. The first part is in first person plural. The second part is in second person.
Interesting.
Yeah. Anyway.
Boy, whoever puts together the links for this episode's show notes, you're going to have a fun time.
Oh, it's end of the year.
I should be responsible for that, since the majority of these are mine. Well, it's been a lot of fun talking with you all about the year 2020. It sounds like we all had a pretty amazing time. I think it's been a great year for Writer's Digest and for all of us, and I hope it is for all of our listeners too. For this episode's writing prompt, I would like you listeners to take a moment to reflect on your writing life in 2022. I think it can be really easy to see what went wrong or what didn't happen, but for this exercise, focus on what went right. Make a list of the things that you're really proud of yourself for, even if it's something that seems really small, like I wrote that one really great sentence that I'm proud of, or I learned something new. You're going to do this without thinking of goals for the new year or what you could do better or what you would like to have done, and instead write about why these wins, no matter their size, are important to you. Thank you for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. If you had a great experience with WD in 2022, we would love to hear about it. We would also like to know what you'd like to see more of. So email us at writers.digest@aimmedia.com to share your story or ideas. We will be back in 2023, but in the meantime, you can always find us at writersdigest.com and on social media at Writers Digest. See you in the new year.